Hello, everybody. Welcome to Random Review, and thank you for joining us. I'm Connie Georgiou. Deborah Goldenberg and I coordinate Random Review for Friends of the Library, which sponsors these events. Deborah, will you join me on the screen and greet our audience?
Hi, everybody. Hope you enjoyed the talk, and I'll see you later.
And our library host today is Mike Hansen. He'll be fielding your questions at the end of the program. Mike, would you like to turn on your camera and say hello?
Hello, thank you for coming today.
A few operational details. If you're having any problems with GoToWebinar, please use the question box or the chat box on your control panel, and we'll try to help you. We are recording this presentation, so if your issues can't be resolved, be assured that a link to the recording will be sent to in your follow-up letter. Also, there'll be a link to a more polished version on the Random Review page of the library website soon. We'll continue to have virtual events until it seems safe to meet in person again at the library. Also on the Random Review webpage, you'll find a link to a list of library books related to today's topic, created by our volunteer, Gail Gerdeman. On the same page, you can sign up to receive monthly Random Review email announcements. And next time you're actually at the library, be sure to pick up one of our Random Review bookmarks with the whole year's schedule on it. We encourage you to submit questions for our speaker at any time during the presentation by typing them into the question box or the chat box, and he'll answer as many as we have time for at the end of the program. I'd like to thank our community sponsors of Random Review, Grassroots Books and Music, Northwest Graphic Imaging, the Corvallis GT, and especially reporter Jim Day. And a big thank you to the best library, and especially librarians Mike Hansen and Bonnie Brzozowski, who have provided indispensable support to us in the presentation of our virtual programs. Next month's review will be on November 10th, when Marjorie Sandor will discuss the book Hamnet, a Novel of the Plague by Maggie O'Farrell, a timely book for these times. And now, I'd like to invite Carl Schreck, a member of our Random Review Book Selection Committee, to introduce today's speaker. Carl, could you join me on the screen?
Hi, Connie.
And I'll say goodbye for now.
And good afternoon, everybody. We're very fortunate today that Bob Beshta, the reviewer of this book on beavers, is a hydrologist, because beavers are also hydrologists. So it's, I think, a pretty natural, perfect fit. Bob has a BS in forestry from Colorado State and MS in hydrology from Utah State. He then worked for the Forest Service as a hydrologist in both the Arapaho and then the Medicine Bow National Forests. After that, he went and got a PhD at the University of Arizona. Since that time, he's been a professor of forestry at OSU, showing up here in 1974. He's now emeritus in that department, or in that college, but he's still extremely active in research. He's taught a host of courses related to watersheds, such as watershed management, forest practices, protecting water quality, slope stability, snow hydrology, and another course on subsurface flow. He's also had a bunch of graduate students. His research, I would say, has primarily revolved around watershed perspective and still looking at ecosystems and the loss and what happens to ecosystems if you lose big predators or if you reintroduce big predators. And much of this work was done mainly in national parks. I think he's worked in about 6, but mainly in Yellowstone. And just to give you a flavor of some of his 100 and more publications, I'll read just a few titles. He published on the role of large predators in maintaining riparian and plant communities and river morphology, bison limit ecosystem recovery in northern Yellowstone, large conifer exploitation linked to loss of overstory aspen in Yellowstone, can large carnivores change streams via trophic cascades? In other words, can they change streams? And also he published on conserving the world's megafauna and biodiversity, The Fierce Urgency of Now. Bob's also had graduate students, I think 4, that have worked on beavers. And that work related to things like sediment transport, storage of water, affecting subsurface flow patterns, and also how beavers might affect peak flow. So as you can see, I think Bob's perfect for a book called Eager, The Surprising and Secret Life of Beavers and Why They Matter. So I'd like to turn this over to Bob, but first we'll show a short video that's of Filbert the beaver at the Oregon Zoo, so you get to see one up close and personal. So Mike, do you want to do that, please?
Hi, everybody. I hope you're enjoying this multimedia presentation we have here with this beaver out of the Portland Zoo. It gives you a chance to see one up close and close, which is something we never ever get a chance to do. Well, again, hello. I hope you enjoyed the brief video, had a chance to see a beaver up close. It's a rare sight being that close. Usually you just see them from the tops when they're in water. But they're a pretty unique animal, as you can see. They're long tail, they're web paws in the back, they're incisor teeth, they're thick fur. They're just pretty unique in a lot of ways. And let me just, okay. And so I wanted to use that as just a brief introduction to give you a sense of what this critter looks like and how it moves around. And one of the things that was trying to do in the video there was trying to build a dam, and that's what these beavers do very naturally. So with that in mind, now I have to okay, I think I have to move off screen. And okay, so I hope we're good here. We had some interesting technical issues going on here. The book, of course, is Eager, Beavers That Matter. Beavers and the secret life of beavers and why they matter, or why do they matter? We could ask the question. Just as a little bit of a background, yes, I've done research in beavers, but I wasn't always involved. So during my college career, I don't remember having a course in which beavers were discussed, maybe even mentioned. They were totally off the radar screen. And so at that point in time, as I came out of my formal education, I had no experience with beavers or in any way, shape, or form. But over the years, I've had a chance to become familiar with their effects on streams and riparian plant communities. So anyways, that situation of not having formal education in beavers is really quite consistent, I would say, with most people that have worked or are working in beavers. They've learned about them, and it's been relatively recently that they've been involved in hydrologic or ecological or economic studies that look at beavers. But they have become increasingly studied by the academic community, and they're increasingly recognized by the general public as to what beaver do on landscapes. Now here we have a photo of Ben Goldfarb. This is from the book, the jacket of the book. Ben's an environmental journalist, award-winning, and who's covered wildlife management and conservation biology topics, published in Science, Mother Jones, The Guardian, High Country News, and others, and has a master's degree in environmental management from the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. And so he's has a great background for this particular topic. And I'd also like to point to you the graph on the side there, which I put together some time ago, but these are publications on beaver, Castor canadensis, the scientific name. And it's over 120 years here. And every decade, basically, through Google, as I just kept track of number of publications. And you can see there's almost none in the early 1900s. And it's not until after the 1950s that something's beginning to happen. And it's really only in the last 3 decades that beaver have been extensively explored and studied and published upon in the scientific community. And so Ben hit it right at the right time, in my opinion. If he'd been 20 years earlier, he would not have had nearly as interesting a story to tell. He was also here on campus a couple of years ago. It was a communication seminar. There were 4 of us involved, a film producer, a speech communicator, Ben Goldfarb, and myself, and we talked about various ways of communicating environmental education to various types of audience. And we all had kind of different skill sets, but he was here and it was great to get a chance to meet him and put a live body to a face. I also want to acknowledge that Corvallis had its very first Beaver plus Beaver Nation celebration day. And it was more than just Beaver Nation, it was actually beavers were being celebrated. So hopefully this will be part of a continuing celebration. So getting back to the book, the foreword is written by Dan Flores. Dan Flores is another well-known science writer, and his works were recently highlighted in a previous library book review by Bill Robbins regarding the book Coyote America. I've since read that book, and I've read another one of his, American Serengeti, and I would recommend both of them. They're quite good. However, with regard to eager, Ben Goldfarb here takes us on a bit of a travel log, both back in time and spatially across North America, and even briefly to Europe. We get to find out when beaver reigned across our landscapes, how and why they lost that reigning position, and what has happened to them since. In the meantime, he shares stories of various people from a diversity of areas and backgrounds that have interacted with beavers in some manner. As part of the preparation for his book, Goldfarb visited over 15 sites across North America with quite a few other phone conversations with other individuals, and he also was at several more sites in Scotland and England. The result then is I would say, a great storytelling as Goldfarb interweaves the lives and experiences of humans and beavers. As a science writer, Ben Goldfarb is actually, I would say, very good at his craft. At the end of his introduction, Ben brings forth a quote from Herman Melville. He says, the quote is, "To produce a mighty book, you must choose a mighty theme." He doesn't claim that his book is a mighty book, but he does claim, I think, that the beaver theme is a mighty theme. And I would suggest that understanding beaver and appreciating them may have major hydrologic and ecological implications for many streams and riparian systems across the United States, particularly during a time of increasing climatic stress. So the book has 10 chapters, and you can see the titles here. And I'm going to work my way through them. The book is actually almost 250 pages long, and is followed by two sections. One includes his notes, his important notes with regard to material covered in an individual chapter. And the second one is an index useful for searching by topic. So if you're interested in a particular aspect of what beaver do, this is a great place to find it. But what I'd like to do is work our way through these chapters. I don't pretend that I will give you a full look at a given chapter, but I will try to maybe give you a flavor of some of the material that is covered in each of these. This first one is this appetite for construction, and this is what you saw in the, of course, in the video. So while many other charismatic megafauna, such as dire wolves, saber-toothed tigers, mastodons, and others, soon disappeared from North America following the end of the Pleistocene, beavers came through this geologic period just fine. Thus, when Europeans arrived in North America, beaver were associated with nearly every pond, stream, and river they encountered. Beaver were almost everywhere. It's been estimated there were somewhere between 15 and 250 million. Now, these are pretty wide confidence limits, but 15 to 250 million beavers were present when Europeans arrived. And the amount of area associated with all these dams, these dam-created ponds, may have submerged an area larger than the states of Nevada and Arizona together. So they had a huge effect on what was existing with regard to along streams and rivers when Europeans arrived. This chapter has a very brief introduction to paleo beavers and then transitions to the present. Here, Goldfarb characterizes what beaver do and what they eat. For most of you, it will be no surprise that they build dams, they have lodges, and they sometimes create burrows and riverbanks. As herbivores, they utilize a wide range of plant material to survive. They will eat grasses, vines, shrubs, small trees, and whatever. They don't always eat woody species. They will eat a lot of other herbaceous types of material. A unique feature of beavers, of course, are their prominent incisors with which they can tackle woody vegetation, such as aspen or willows or cottonwoods, for food and for building in-stream structures. Their teeth grow continuously, and thus only by chewing on woody material can they keep them at the right length. Now, in this introductory chapter, Ben Goldfarb begins to introduce some of these ideas, but I've just summarized, you will see these scattered throughout the book. So the question might be, why are beaver keystone species, or what is it that beaver do, since they are considered to be these ecosystem engineers and keystone species? Well, the dams they build create ponds and wetlands. These dams also spread water and store groundwater. That is, the ponded water behind them will be spread over floodplains and will be stored in subsurface environments. Their ponds will trap sediment, thereby improving water quality. They promote the fact that you have a dam and a pond there will promote diverse plant communities to grow. These beavers are huge with regard to improving biodiversity. Ponds and vegetation provide valuable habitat for salmonids and other aquatic species, terrestrial wildlife species, avian species, amphibians, you name it, and the list goes on and on and on. These environments are also capable of resisting and moderating the effects of climate change. So there's a huge plus upside, ecologically, environmentally, in some ways economically, for having beaver on the landscape. Again, these themes will show up in various places in various chapters. The second chapter is one entitled Dislodged, which indicates something, something perhaps quite dramatic might happen, and indeed it did. When Euro-Americans, or I should say simply Europeans, arrived on the North American continent, they found beavers widespread across the continent and very abundant. Furthermore, beaver populations had coexisted with Native Americans for thousands of years and invariably were intertwined with most of those cultures. Yet for economic reasons, and consistent with this theme later of Manifest Destiny, Europeans and Euro-Americans pretty much tried to extirpate beaver from landscapes. And they did this across the continent. They started on the East Coast, they worked westward, and as they did so, beavers were widely trapped, killed, and eventually removed. Beaver pelts were a major economic driver for human expansion across the West. And beaver pelts and trapping were also the mechanism by which, as a country, we began to understand the geography of the American West, because these trappers went everywhere. Goldfarb looks at the occurrence of beaver through the eyes, at least one of his examples, through the eyes of Lewis, through the eyes of the Lewis and Clark expedition as they worked their way up the Missouri in 1805. While Lewis and Clark frequently comment on the magnitude of buffalo and elk and pronghorn and wolves megafauna, they also noted that some beavers are usually present in any of the wooded areas bordering the river. As they continued to move upstream on the Missouri, beaver became much more prevalent and were seen to be increasingly affecting the river and its tributary streams. And they began to find tributary streams where beaver ponds were strung along them like pearls on a necklace, just one dam and pond after another along their entire length. However, like the buffalo and other species, this period of abundance was not to last. Less than 40 years later, 40 years, in 1843, John James Audubon traveled 2,200 miles up the Missouri in search of animals to paint. He did not see a single beaver. So the transition from abundance to scarcity had already taken place. Beaver in Oregon, well known and highly publicized as the Beaver State, had their beaver populations decimated by the Hudson's Bay Company in the early to mid 1800s, populations that have never really recovered. Settlers in Oregon, like in most states across North America, characterized beavers as varmints, and that designation has largely stuck even up to recent years. Characterizing them as varmints effectively allowed landowners, and it actually encouraged them, to trap or kill beavers whenever or wherever they occurred. This practice largely continues to date in many areas of the United States. As we think about the Beaver State, and many of you may recognize this wonderful iconic beaver on the state flag, but probably don't realize that by 1859, beaver were almost entirely gone from the state of Oregon. We had done our level best to try and get rid of them. Chapter 3 shifts gears a little bit, moves into some recent technology. Whenever beavers, as you saw in the video, whenever beavers hear water flowing in any situation, they have this inherent urge to plug the overflow. That is, they build dams, and they're good at it. Goldfarb also tells of an experiment that was conducted in a room, an empty room with beavers, some woody material, and the sound of running water. So here we have this open room. We got beavers, we have sticks on the floor, and they then pipe in running water, the sound of running water. And so you might imagine, well, what will these beavers do? Well, what they did was they tried to construct a dam across the floor. No water present, just the sound. So they are hardwired to build dams. Beavers not only have a propensity to build dams, but to continually build them larger and larger over time. Thus, if beavers return to a stream, landowners may at first be okay with them. But over time, that attitude changes sometimes as beaver may begin to increasingly flood stream adjacent areas, such as roads and fields and maybe root structures. This is where the quote new technology can come into play. In this chapter, Goldfarb describes some devices that are able to route flows through a dam, keep water levels in a pond constant, and thus stop the beaver's continual desire to build back better their initial dams. And this is an example of a structure that Goldfarb, he talks about several different ideas in this chapter, but this is one of them that can be used, sometimes called a beaver deceiver or a flow leveler. Now, there's a lot of interest in putting beaver back on landscape. And this is a chapter is about people in various places that are trying to that are being involved in beaver reintroductions and trying to overcome the challenges of doing so. And certainly a common characteristic of these advocates for beaver reintroduction is their desire to make streams a better environment for fish, for plants, for wildlife, and so on. Thus, they often try to do what is necessary to make newly establishing beavers compatible with the wants and needs of landowners. Sometimes they're successful and sometimes not, but with the persistence of a beaver, they keep on trying. So those folks that get involved in beaver relocation and introductions, they really get into it heart and soul. if you're interested, if one was interested in putting a mixed pair of beavers, that is a male and female into the landscape, one of the fundamental challenges is to be able to determine its sex. For reasons that Goldfarb explains, it turns out that this is not a simple task. In fact, it's pretty difficult. But he also provides a solution, and the solution has a rather unique twist. So you can find out and become informed. The realm of the damned. Here's a couple of the photos I have here. One is an air photograph on the right, this upper right-hand side. We're looking down, and here's a dam. It's about 150 feet long. And there's a beaver lodge here, and there's a beaver lodge here. And you can see how skinny and small the stream is where it's not dammed, but you can see the huge area that this dam will make. And here's a picture on the ground of a dam, again, showing that same effect. And these areas, of course, become very, very important with regard to fish habitat. This chapter takes a closer look at beaver dams and the aquatic habitats they provide. At least some fisheries biologists have long known that beaver dams provide a crucial link in the life cycle of many anadromous and native fish species. For example, from Oregon to Alaska, young coho salmon historically made major use of beaver dams as rearing habitat before they headed to the ocean. As young fish, freshly emerging, they would live in beaver ponds for the winter or so, and then become smolts and move to the ocean. I had a chance to find out firsthand how important this was. We were doing research up in Southeast Alaska and had been doing so for a number of years. And it was a stream called Trap Creek on Baranof Islands, about 70 miles south of Juneau. And this stream was really pretty neat in a way. It had lots of large wood, which is important. It had deep pools, clear water, had all the features I thought of a stream that would be great for fish, but it didn't have many fish. And one day the fisheries biologist, the researcher from the Forest Service experiment station in Juneau came to the field, and I asked him, his name was Andy Dolliff, and I said to Andy, I said, this stream has got all the features I thought would be great for fish. What's going on? How come I don't see them? He said, well, let's take a field trip tomorrow. Next morning, we went to the adjacent drainage, which is the Cadishan River, a larger stream, noted for its salmon production. And we started walking up river a bit, and we met some tributaries, and then we would go up these tributaries. And as we very quickly found that we were into this very complex, a big complex of beaver ponds. And he said, this is where it happens. This is where fish rear. This is what's so important in the salmon life cycle. And so I was, after that point, have been tuned into the fact that these ponds, whether I'm in Eastern Oregon looking at native fish or along the coast or in Southeast Alaska, beaver ponds play this big role. So of course, one of the really interesting and close to home stories in this chapter focuses on beavers and salmon in tribal lands in Western Washington, and how a really important 1855 treaty between Governor Stevens and Chief Seattle is playing out today. A component of the treaty stipulated that Indians were entitled to fish at their usual and accustomed places. Because of this treaty and subsequent court decisions, tribes now have a major share of fish runs in the Columbia, but they have something else. They also are actively involved in the management and relocation of beaver on federal lands, such as on national forest. The reasoning being that good beaver management is good fish management. And indeed, there's increasing amounts of data to confirm that story. Because of the importance of beaver dams for fish, some biologists have been interested in augmenting the dam building process in streams where beavers are present by providing a stable component. And that stable component can be a tree that is felled into the stream, in which the beavers then can begin to anchor their dams with. In other cases, folks are trying vertical posts pounded into the bed of the stream across the channel, and in which some water flows through, but it gives, again, beaver a chance to anchor their dams. In essence, an attempt to jumpstart the construction of beaver dams in certain areas. And in some places, it seems to provide an ecological boost. But having beaver present in their original dams is really the major ecological boost that occurs. This beaver is having a particularly bad hair day, I would say. But it was a photo that I included because you also get a chance to see up close the incisors of a beaver, the front teeth, and these are the ones that are so effective. The chapter on California streaming is indeed about California. And there's been a conundrum down there about were beavers present, how many, all these kinds of things. When Europeans arrived, what happened? Were there beaver? How far? How many? All these kinds of things. The history of beaver presence and absence in California is explored by Goldfarb through the lens of time, illustrating how science and human perceptions can and have changed and what this means for beavers. In contrast to Oregon, where beavers were originally abundant, most biologists and historians in California had generally accepted the concept that the state had historically been beaver-free, by and large beaver-free. Goldfarb looks at the beaver presence absence conundrum and uncovers some really noteworthy twists, turns, and unexpected revelations. I found this to be a very interesting chapter, and one in which I learned a lot about things that I did not know about and that I had accepted as being kind of like dogma. There's been some new science there that's turned things upside down a bit. Goldfarb also notes in this chapter that the California Department of Fisheries and Wildlife was incredibly slow to accept the important role beaver could have in creating productive fish and wildlife habitat. That agency has begun to shift their views in recent years, but as Goldfarb found out as he delved into the story, the agency has been really resistant, consistently resistant. Not surprisingly, this resistance or reluctance of fish and wildlife biologists and state agencies to understand and accept the ecological benefits of beavers has occurred in many states across the West, and he will explain to you why this occurs. This is probably one of my favorite chapters. I mean, how could anyone be against making the desert bloom? But we might really want to ask, did it previously bloom? And are we only discovering that fact now? Here we have two photos. The upper one showing a degraded stream system, happens to be in Utah, or I'm not Utah, but Nevada, and down below is the same stream system a few years later with beaver in it. The thrust of this chapter is a case study that takes place in northeast Nevada, in the heart of the inland sea of sagebrush and about as deserty as one might get. Beaver were once present along streams of this landscape, and like elsewhere across the American West, their populations were obliterated in this situation due to two major factors. The first was by the extensive and intensive trapping that occurred in the late 1700s and early 1800s. And the second is the widespread and intensive grazing from introduced livestock that came in after the trapping. It is this second factor that has resulted in widespread alteration of streams and riparian plant communities. These changes in vegetation have continued to the present in many areas and have largely prevented any significant recovery of beaver in the arid landscapes of the American West. However, in northeast Nevada, a change in grazing management has resulted in beaver recovery and, in the words of Goldfarb, restored the ecological and hydrologic health of a previously badly degraded stream. And this is the example we're looking at in the photographs here. Thus, making the desert bloom again. Goldfarb provides other examples that provide powerful testament to the notion that beavers can thrive alongside properly managed livestock. But this is a message that has not yet been accepted in the mainstream culture of the Western ranching community. Footholds are there. Some ranchers have become firm believers in changing and adjusting livestock management to get beaver back, but it is not yet widespread. Chapter 8 is about Wolftopia, Yellowstone National Park, wolves and beavers, and perhaps it doesn't get much better than this. Here we have an iconic national park as well as the two major keystone species of the American West, wolves and beavers. Although beavers in the Yellowstone region were heavily trapped in the early 1800s, as was done elsewhere in the West, they largely recovered from that trapping, and by the early 1900s, The greater Yellowstone ecosystems again had beaver almost everywhere. But that did not last long. In the 1920s, about a century ago, wolves were extirpated from the park, much like they had been across the West. And here again, the ecological disaster associated with this human intervention played out. With wolves gone, increased elk browsing soon began to destroy woody riparian plant communities that represented the primary food source for beavers. And thus, food resources for their beaver soon dried up or were lost, let's say, due to this increased browsing. Within a decade or two of wolf extirpation, so the wolves are gone in the 1920s, but within a decade or two, beaver populations followed and were essentially gone from northern Yellowstone by the 1950s. So by getting rid of wolves, we also seemingly got rid of beaver. The wolf story has been told a lot, but the beaver story has not been told nearly as much. But as many of you know, Yellowstone has experienced a major ecological readjustment in recent decades. Wolves were reintroduced into the park in 1995-96, a quarter of a century ago, and have since altered elk behavior and reduced their numbers. As a result, various woody plant species such as aspen, cottonwood, alder, willows, berry-producing shrubs, and others have begun to recover, providing usable habitat for beavers. And this photograph in the lower left with a beaver dam is actually a photo that was taken just this fall. It's on Blacktail Deer Creek, and the beaver dam is about 4 to 4.5 feet tall, and it is spreading water across this willow meadow, if you can call it that. And these beaver have been in place now for about 5 years. There had been no beaver in this stream for over 70 years. We now have beaver in this stream at this location for over 5 years, and they're doing what beaver do. They're spreading water. They're causing water to be stored. They're causing increased plant biodiversity. They are creating bird habitat. See more birds here than they never used to see any birds. Anyways, lots going on here. So what does this grand experiment of wolf reintroduction mean for beaver? It means that beaver can again begin to reoccupy some of their former habitats and again function as a keystone species. Beaver numbers in recent years have begun to increase, but we're really going to have to wait and see if this trend continues. It's an experiment. We don't know what the end game is yet. We'll see. Here, Goldfarb shifts gears and does indeed take us across the pond. Some of you may have read a news release about a month or so ago regarding Scottish farmers being upset with their newly reintroduced beavers. Historically, farmers, whether Scottish, American, or otherwise, have never taken kindly to beavers. So when you put an animal like beaver back on the landscape, some changes in farming practices may need to be considered. Some give and take may have to occur if you want beaver to be present. This is really a pretty good, this is a good chapter at looking at how humans often respond to the return of a missing species, in this case, by the reintroduction of beavers. And you find that some people love them for whatever reason, and some people don't. And here, like nearly everywhere, it takes time to assimilate these alternative perspectives. Beaver reintroductions are not easy, they're not simple, and they often have conflict. So it's the idea of learning to live with a species that has been absent for 100 years or so takes a bit of time, but may well be worth it. Anyways, lastly, the chapter, which really brings us full circle in a way and synthesizes various arguments as to why we so desperately need more beavers in streams and rivers across the West, as well as other portions of North America. And as this print here taken from the book shows, the biodiversity that beavers create is pretty significant. This chapter also emphasizes the fact that getting beaver back will not require the investments of a new space program, but instead it often requires a change in the mindset of many, many Americans. And perhaps this could be a more difficult task, who knows? This chapter also explains why, if you visit the Malheur Wildlife Refuge, you won't see many beaver. It's a perfect place for them, but you won't see many of them. But anyways, it's a great synthesis chapter. So I came to the end of this book. I had read this book actually a couple of years ago after it came out. In preparation for this, I actually listened to it again to refurbish my memories of what went on here. One of the things that occurs in this book, and it occurs in many audiobooks I've had, is the pronunciation of words. And so you may, as you get into this book, you may find that words like kokanee, salmonids, siskiyous, willamette, and others are going to jar you a bit. Willamette, of course, turns out to be the Williamette. So it's a problem. It's not the author's problem, it's the reader's problem, but it's a common problem. So anyways, as I was looking at assessing this book, I was thinking about criteria that I think are important. How timely is this book? As I indicated with that graph early on, the scientific community has really quite recently come to realize the extremely important and necessary roles that beavers play in stream and aquatic ecosystem, as well as for overall watershed health. They are a key player. Thus, Ben Goldfarb had a treasure trove of new information to assimilate, understand, and synthesize for readers. It was a great opportunity. So I think this is a very timely book. As far as accuracy, the book covers a lot of topics, beaver related, if you will, and some that I claim that I really can't judge on. There are chapters that I did feel like I knew about, and sometimes I felt like a little bit like the twist that was presented was not quite right, but by and large, for the material he covered, I think he did a great job of pulling it together, and I would say by and large, it represents an accurate view of what's going on. As far as breadth and completeness, now if we're trying to get wide and being complete, you can't do all these at the same time without creating a huge tome. Here he takes us through time. He starts with beavers that were historically present on landscapes and lets us know how, why, and where their presence was so severely altered, and what might be again. In addition, he provides an important overview as to some of the innovations in technology that have allowed humans to increasingly learn how to live with beavers, that is, how to coexist. So he covers the waterfront in a lot of ways, and he provides sufficient depth that I think it allows you to really fully understand and come to grips with the various issues. His writing style, it's, for me, easy to read and informative. He takes a reading on an interesting and logical progression through various topics. It appears that he is both a good science writer and a good storyteller. And it's a combination that works well for this book. The hopeful criteria is perhaps an interesting one, but I find that today it's hard to find books on an environmental issue where there is a realistically hopeful ending. Goldfarb has picked a topic where beaver may indeed be awaiting us if we allow them to, that a better future may indeed be awaiting us if we allow beavers to again work their magic on streams, riparian areas, and watersheds. And with Goldfarb's book Eager in Hand, we now know why it is so important to do so. He does answer the question, why do they matter? Obviously, by now you'll know my recommendation is obviously positive. I find that this book is well suited for a wide audience, including the general public, as well as those with an academic background in ecology, ecosystems, whatever. I might even go so far as to recommend that every student at Oregon State University majoring in natural resources be given a copy of this book at graduation. After hearing about Beaver Nation, beaver fever, and giving a damn during their entire stay at Corvallis, I would suggest that the story of Castor canadensis as told by author Ben Goldfarb has much to offer them as they pass through their lives and careers. So I would say give them a book. And finally, I think the book can be summed up in 2 words, and that is, go Beavs. Why, thank you.
Thank Thank you, Bob. That was very interesting. I didn't ever know so much about beavers. We have now it's time for a Q&A. We have a few questions already. A couple that we have are related to nutria, so it's interesting. One question is, how has the invasion of nutria affected beavers? And another is, how do nutria interact with beavers?
Those are great questions, but I can't answer them. I'm not a mammal biologist. I look at the effects of beavers. The work I've done, the research I've been involved with, and the things that I read, I'm really interested in what beavers do and what are the effects of that. And how they interact with other populations has really been of secondary purpose for me. Now, for others, it may be a big deal, and I really don't. And so I don't know the answer to the nutria problem. I do know that wolves, that in Yellowstone, for example, that a beaver are a prey species for wolves, and so there is an interaction going on there. So having wolves isn't necessarily always positive for beavers. They are a primary food source in many ways for wolves. But I'm sorry, I can't answer the nutria question.
No problem. Let's see. So another question we have is a question of why don't we turn over national beaver management to Native Americans? They're the only ones that seem to know what they're doing regarding beavers, apparently. As
Good question.
suggested by there.
In the example I provided, in a way that's happening in the Washington side of the Columbia, Native Americans up there are becoming very active in doing beaver management on public lands. That has not extended to other areas, but in reality, with treaty obligations, if we allow them to become manifest, it may well be that tribal cultures or tribal nations will take a more proactive part in beaver management across public lands of Oregon at some point in time. So that could well play out. We're in an incredible transition period right now. Just like the science has been changing greatly, lots of other things have been changing. And so those kinds of management questions, that's a great one. And we'll see how it plays out.
Another question from an audience member is, are there currently any efforts to work with beavers to mitigate climate change?
Good question. Climate change, of course, is the crisis. Beaver are a positive generally with regard to that. When beavers build dams and create ponds, they also increase the extent of riparian plant communities, which often comprise woody species. And in doing so, they increase the amount of carbon that is sequestered from the atmosphere. They do so with the above ground parts of the plants, also the below ground. So they're a real positive in that way with regard to pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. Now, they're not going to solve the problem by itself, but they're a component of it. The other thing is they resist the increase in stream temperatures and things that we are seeing, let's say in the American West right now. If you have beaver ponds up and down a stream system, the concept that the stream temperatures are going to increase is it's not as big a deal. The other part is by storing water with their ponds and subsoils, we end up having higher flows in summer, and that also then helps provide cooler water for fish and amphibians and other aquatic organisms. So they're a real positive in the climate crisis story. And to be effective, though, we need more of them.
Interesting. That kind of goes with the next question, which is, do beaver dams obstruct salmon migration? I mean, I just heard you say that it creates cooler water, which might be good for salmon. So
yes. One of the really interesting themes, even when I came to Oregon State in the 1980s, and it was across the West, is beaver dams obstruct salmon. So therefore, that's justification for not only going out there and getting rid of their dams, that's justification for going out there and getting rid of beavers. So the concept was we got to have these really, really cleaned out stream systems so salmon could make their runs upstream. The research has since found that that is not the case, that fish, anadromous fish, native fish species are really quite good at navigating over beaver dams and getting past them. And so having beaver dams on the landscape is generally considered to be a huge, huge plus. Now, there may be a dam or two at some time that will prohibit salmon from moving up past it or whatever. But the vast majority of them, at high flows or in winter, whatever, when water's flowing in the streams, salmon have learned how to navigate and get up over these dams and move into spawning, rearing habitat upstream. And that's what they're trying to do. So that particular paradigm has changed dramatically. And I haven't heard, it's a great question you've asked, because it was very common several decades ago, but I haven't heard anybody make that argument today. I think we are finally over the hump on that one, but thanks for asking.
Yeah, that's interesting. See, another question we have is what's happening with state beaver management? So in state of Oregon, I'm guessing.
Oh, that's a loaded question. Let me just say that there is quite a bit of interest by a whole host of groups on trying to get more beaver on Oregon landscapes. And if you are interested in that topic, I would say get involved, because it needs all the help it can get. The data I'm familiar with, if I ask the simple question, well, where are we at today relative to where we once were? The answer I keep coming up with, we are at the number of beaver and the number of dams on our landscapes, whether it's public land, private land, state land, whatever, the effects of beaver and their dams is at an incredibly low level relative to what we once had and what we might once have again, because there have been some modeling done looking at the capability for streams east side, west side to support beaver. And those models tell us we have a lot of capability. It's just unfulfilled right now. So beaver management, there is a beaver working group right now that has been put together by Oregon Department of Fisheries and Wildlife. And that group is actually meeting this afternoon. They've been meeting periodically for the last several months, but that's the question right now that they are trying to address. Where do we go next with regard to beaver management and protections in the state of Oregon? And we will see where it shakes out. I don't know.
See, another question is related to Yellowstone. What impact has the influx of bison into Yellowstone had on beaver populations and vice versa, if you're aware of that, familiar?
Since the wolves came back, I told you part of the big part of the story is since the wolves came back, plants are doing better in tributary streams, and we're indeed seeing beaver coming back. That story I'm totally comfortable with. But there are some places that things aren't going so well. And since wolves came back, the numbers of bison have increased dramatically. We went from 400 bison in the northern range to over 4,000. 4,000 bison in a fairly small area of the northern range is just wreaking havoc on plant communities there. And so there is no capability for beaver to come back in areas where now bison are prevalent. On the tributary streams where bison are not right now are not going much, beaver are doing well, riparian plant communities are doing well. But on the main valley bottoms, if next time you go to Yellowstone, if you go to the northern range and you're going to see lots and lots of bison. But the question you should ask is, well, where are the willows? Where are all the young cottonwoods? Where are all the riparian plants? And without those, there's no capability to support beavers. So you won't see any beaver at all on the valley bottoms.
Interesting. I think you talked about this a little bit already, but the question here is, what has to happen to get the Oregon legislature to enact legislation to protect the beaver? I don't know if you had anything to add to that. You talked about groups meeting already to plan this out. But yeah.
What it's going to take is public input. It's going to take the public's going to have to get involved and say you want them back. Right now, there's huge resistance by certain groups to do anything different, and that's if the public gets involved, that's one way of doing it. But otherwise, we may be stuck. We'll see.
All right. And we have time maybe for one last question, and I'm going to read you this question. It's interesting. When I was young, I was told beavers had the strength and ability to pull a human into a beaver pond and drown the person. Is that possible?
I don't, I don't know. I know alligators can do it and crocodiles can do it, but I for the life of me, can't imagine a 40-pound beaver could drag an adult or even a kid. Why would they want to do that? They're herbivores. They're herbivores. They're
Yeah,
not carnivores. They may have the teeth of a carnivore, but they're herbivores. So, you know, yeah, I'm unaware of any place that has happened.
right. All right, that's great. Well, thank you very much for your review. It was very interesting, insightful. People, don't forget to sign up for the next random review. I put the sign up link in the chat if you want to look there, and I'll invite the other members of the group to come on and say goodbye to you all.
I'll add my thanks to you, Bob, for that wonderful discussion of beavers. And I apologize for the earlier technical difficulty. It's a mystery to me too.
Okay. Yep. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Have a
everybody.
good day.
Thank you, everybody. See you next time.
Okay.